So the Harry Potter books have taken me on a kind of strange and magical journey through science. And I really was inverting the way that you guys would think about communicating science and engagement. You know, you do something and you want to explain that to the public. I thought, well, let's start off with something the public is really besotted with, the Potter books, and I was besotted with them as well. Let's have a bit of fun. I talked about 100 scientists, and I tried to unpack the science behind the latest developments. And the second half of the book, I also really looked at why we're superstitious, which is a kind of an amazingly interesting subject in its own right. And you can imagine there's a kind of theme running through here. We talk about science fiction. I think there's some interesting connections between the origins of myths, model making, and science fiction as well. And I quite literally went on travels. I went to the world's first Harry Potter conference in Orlando, Nimbus 2003. It was a bit of a bizarre experience because it was organized online. I didn't really know what I was letting myself in for, but I found that it was driven by mostly young women writing /fiction, which I didn't really even know about. But I found myself in workshops where they were kind of homoerotic fantasies about Harry falling in love with Draco Malfoy and what would have happened. And I did kind of get a sense of what on earth am I doing here, but it was kind of good fun. So there I was in Orlando and trying to, talk a little bit about my very more prosaic scientific perspective on all this. So the kind of things I was looking at was, for example, in the legend of the Griffin, we know that Harry's house was Gryffindor. That means Golden Griffin. Griffins are used as guards in the Potter books. If you knock on Dumbledore's office, the knocker is a griffin. And there's a really lovely story, a lovely account for where the myth of the Griffin came from the American academic Adrienne Mayer, who specializes in what's called folk science. She was looking at how pre-scientific cultures interpreted the world and how they were trying to rationalize the world from what they understood then. So it's a kind of proto-science. And from that, you can sort of understand where many ancient myths came from. And her basic proposition was, what if monstrous creatures once roamed the earth where these legends first arose? And she explored this in her book, The First Fossil Hunters. So, I know not everyone agrees about this, but I think that many giants and monsters of myth are not just pure imaginary constructions. They're really trying to make sense of the bones of long extinct creatures. And here's one of them, Protoceratops. Mayer links this to the griffin and the fact that a couple of thousand years ago, you had gold miners trying to seek their fortunes in the Gobi Desert. These are the Scythians. They were horse-riding people. They controlled much of Central Asia. They were around from about 800 BC to AD 200. And there were travelers' tales reported by Greek authors about how in the scorching heat of the Gobi, the miners battled not only the elements and so on, and the blazing sun, but the mighty griffin. So we all know that you don't see dinosaur fossils every day, but actually it turns out that in the Gobi you do see Protoceratops quite a lot. And if you walk around the hillsides, you can often see the remains of a Protoceratops being eroded out. So this thing was prowling around 80 million years ago. It's about 8 feet long. The bony frill at the top of the fossil can break off to suggest ears. It's got a beak, it's got 5-toed feet. And you can imagine if you were hunting for gold at that time and you came across the remains of one of these, it would frighten the living daylights out of you. You'd think one of these must be roaming around just around the corner. So it's quite easy to see how these kind of legends of the griffin got going. So what about dragons? Where could dragons come from? Well, obviously, Harry Potter's world, loads of dragons. Could they possibly be real? Well, of course they can. And again, if you take Mayer's hypothesis, and for example, the Chinese variety, always got these big ears, you can link them to prehistoric mammals that were around in China and Mongolia. And so she cites the I Ching, which talks about dragons in fields, and Mayer and a UK paleontologist called Kenneth Oakley thought that the ears were inspired by the antlers of fossil deer. And then you've also got other dragon sightings inspired by fossil dinosaur tracks and so on and so forth. And just recently, we had the Children's Museum of Indianapolis ask Mayer to look into this 66 million year old dinosaur, not pound. And its long muzzle and spiky horns had a sort of a magical element about it. The creature was called Dracorex hogwartsia, in honor of J.K. Rowling, of course. And again, there are, in that area, you get the Sioux people who've got the myth of a mythical horned water monster called Unkteki, which kind of roamed around the South Dakota Badlands, where this fossil was unearthed. And again, you wonder whether the Sioux had ever come across remains like this. And if you see these vases, some of these vases from antiquity, you can see the Greeks and the Romans were very well aware of long extinct creatures. They came across these fossilized bones, and they really tried to make sense of them. And I think it's a kind of ancient form of sci-fi, really. And you can speculate even more wildly. So what about the basilisk in the Potter books? Well, maybe that's something to do with Gigantophis, which is a great prehistoric snake that was around about 40 million years ago in the Sahara and so on. So again, are these totally mythic creations? I think actually they're people trying to rationalize in their own way, using their knowledge at the time, some very strange findings. Now, it's great to be an Imperial, actually, because one of the things that surprised me about doing the book was I was desperate to find an invisibility cloak. And I really struggled at the time to account for it. So, okay, we've got the Douglas Adams explanation. Do you know what that is at all? Everything is something that's invisible is bathed in a sep field, which is basically someone else's problem. And it didn't really help me very much, obviously. And then you got cuttlefish, they got chromatophores, and they use that to blend into the background. Actually, it's fascinating hearing that discussion of artificial intelligence, because I would certainly love to get inside of the mind of an octopus. I mean, that for me really is alien intelligence on Earth. You've got things like adaptive camouflage, which is studied by NASA. You've got things like glass fish. Again, not hugely satisfying. You've got a primitive form of an invisibility cloak. So Susumi Tachi of Tokyo University came up with this one. Hope this is going to launch. There we are. So what he's doing is he's taking images of behind this individual and just projecting them on the front. So it's not bad. But it's not brilliant. But then more recently, we had this. Chen Hongsheng from, I think it was Zhejiang University, hexagonal box that made a fish and a cat invisible by bending light around the animals. And you can sort of see the fish poking out here, sort of in the middle of these prisms. Very high quality optical glass and so on. And that's kind of the basic concept behind an invisibility cloak. Don't know how much more we want to see of this. I think they're trying to drive the fish out of this primitive sort of invisibility cloak. There we go. So, but what really amazed me was a couple of years after I wrote the book, there were not one, but 4 different mathematical schemes for invisibility. And actually probably the best known came from Sir John Pendry, who obviously works here. It's a few hundred yards from my treadmill desk. I like to think of him as the kind of Albus Dumbledore of Imperial. And here he is. And he came up with a concept that by creating metamaterials, you could make light flow around an object. We all know how to bend light with mirages and so on. These are Sir John's slides. I'm sure you're all familiar with them, but you've got baking sun on asphalt. You get a gradient in air density, the light bends, and then that apparent puddle of water you see is actually a splash of sky instead. So he came up with these schemes based on metamaterials where they've got very unusual properties, where you've got a negative refractive index, where light is bent the wrong way, as it were. And then you can start talking about cloaks. And metamaterials, they're materials designed down to the kind of wavelength that you're trying to play with. So here again, here's some of his concept. So you can cloak that red area, the light flows around it. If you're standing on one side and looking at a wizard on the other side, or so you can have Harry in that red area, the light would flow around, he would be invisible. And actually, when I met John in his office, he waved this thing around. It looked like a sort of weird pizza base or something. But it turns out to be a microwave metamaterial, which he developed with Duke University in the States. And clearly, to come up with a metamaterial that's going to interfere with light, you've really got to get down to light wavelengths or so. So if you've got violet and purple light, we're talking about 700 billionths, violet or purple light, 400 billionths of a meter, 700 billionths deep red light, and so on. So we've got to design metamaterials, these tiny length scales, to manipulate light this way. And so you can start to think about a kind of metamaterial cloak in principle. I think in practice it will be, I think they've done cloaking at specific wavelengths, tiny scales, but at least in principle we can come up with an invisibility cloak now. So I think that's pretty cool. Now what about King's Cross Station, departure point for Hogwarts, of course. Famous for platform 9 3/4. And in fact, what's interesting is that J.K. Rowling actually was thinking of Euston Station, or rather, for some reason, she had a mental picture of Euston Station, but she said King's Cross, so she got them muddled up. So can we walk through walls? Well, there are technologies to do this, and here's one of them, which is something called a fog screen, where you get a highly laminar flow, and you just project things on that. It's a bit primitive. These are really early versions of it, but you can see easily how you can project effects. Have we got more than that? Oh, here we go. So there's something, I think they've got them more laminar now and so on. Don't actually know what's happened to fog screen ink, whether they're still going or not. This is from many years ago, but that would be one muggle solution for this problem. There are actually more impressive versions than that. But anyway, you get the sense of where I'm coming from there. So it's quite easy to segue from this sort of thing to ghosts. And there's probably tons of neuroscientists in the audience, so I won't dwell on it too much, but I think that I'm certainly convinced that ghosts are real in the sense that people do believe them, because the more you find out about how the brain tricks you, the more you think you really can't believe your senses at all. I mean, the fact you're looking at me now, optic nerve plugged in the back of your eye, you've got blind spots the size of about 6 moons in the sky, and yet your brain is papering over those spots in your vision. There are things like the Necker cube illusion. Very everyday activities, when you read, your eyes flicking backwards and forwards, there's saccades, there are fixations of 250 milliseconds, then your eyes swiveling 2 to 5 degrees over sort of a few say 50 milliseconds or so, your brain's editing all that out. You don't notice any of that stuff. You'd feel very seasick indeed. You'd see a big blur if you could see what the eyes are seeing. And so through visual illusions, you do get lots of lovely examples of where a static image can trigger apparent motion in the brain, and so on and so forth. I don't know have you all seen the gorilla video of Dan Simon's? Yeah, you must have. Everyone. I think it's wrecked now, but I do remember the excitement of seeing a sort of virgin audience seeing that, and the consternation. You've changed the video. They just really didn't believe it at all. And those amazing experiments, where people are being stopped in a university square, asked for directions. The moment they're chatting to someone, a door's brought between them. They swap the person asking for directions with someone who's of a different sex, with a beard, much taller, much shorter. And people only notice half the time or something like that. It's incredible. Change blindness when you see it. And there are loads and loads of these things. This one's upside down, but of course this is the image I just showed you. It's interesting the way we can trick our senses, because we've got machinery that's interested in faces as a whole, but when upside down doesn't seem quite so interested in the fact that we've got elements of the face upside down as well. So, when you talk about ghosts specifically, okay, where do ghosts come from? Well, there's some really fascinating, well-documented effects like sleep paralysis. If you talk to Al Chain at the University of Washington in Canada, a lot of people, he's collected over the years many, many accounts of sleep paralysis, and it's very dramatic if you've been through it. You're in a kind of twilight state. You don't act out your dreams because your brain switches off your ability to move, but sometimes you get in a state where you're quite conscious, but you're still paralyzed. And when you've been through that, some people talk about sensing a presence, such as a spectral figure or ghost, an elderly person dressed in old-fashioned costume. And when you look through history at various phenomena described by people in Newfoundland, there's descriptions of old hag, because the idea was that an old woman was squatting on your chest, stopping you from moving. The Chinese talked about gui ya, which is ghost pressure, and so on. In ancient Japan, a giant devil was blamed. In the 70s, lots of stuff about alien abductions. I wonder whether these were reports of sleep paralysis. Things like gargoyles. You've got fascinating reports of Charles Bonnet syndrome, people who are losing their sight gradually because the brain is trying to interpret degraded information, often see very striking visual hallucinations. And Dominic Fitch of the Institute of Psychiatry did a lot of work on this. They fall into a handful of categories. You've got distorted faces, you've got costume figures, you've got other bewildering apparitions, phantoms. They often wear period clothing. That's kind of bizarre, isn't it? 40% saw of people, sufferers of this, saw people in costume, knights, Edwardian costume, Napoleonic uniforms. They often wear hats. The disembodied or distorted face of a stranger with staring eyes and prominent teeth was seen by about half of people. Sometimes in outline like a cartoon. Often the faces were described as looking like gargoyles. And he speculated about whether hallucinations occur when the brain's lateral occipital region alerts us to the possibility that what we're looking at might be a face, but it's not really very interested in where the components of the face are. And this could somehow underline these gargoyle-like distortions. So, when you say to me, are ghosts real? Well, I think, again, in the sense of people, particularly in bygone ages, trying to make sense of these strange hallucinations and effects, yes. What about hats? Why on earth do wizards, why does Professor McGonagall wear hats? Some great literature psychology literature talking about the importance of height. Larger males more able to win fights, more dominant, more likely to reproduce. Huge literature showing that taller people do better. I think in the 40s, there was a study showing that tall salesmen were more successful than their shorter colleagues. And interestingly, if you ask, there were some interesting experiments where people of different stature, people were asked to speculate what they did. And again, there was a link between height and authority. And actually, it works the other way around. You overestimate the height of someone you haven't met who's a celebrity. And in fact, a lot of celebrities are really quite tiny. You know, Dustin Hoffman, 5'5", Madonna, 5'4". Had the fun of taking Tom Cruise around the Science Museum a few months back. He's kind of classic astronaut build, which is taller than I was led to believe, although all my friends tell me that he has some elaborate platform heel apparatus that makes him look taller. But anyway, there's a lot of quite short celebrities who you think are much bigger because of this effect. And there's even some sort of ancient wizard hats here. These have been found, remains of these in Europe, embellished with all sorts of symbols, sun and moon symbols, thought to be the Metonic cycle, where you get about 235 lunar months, adding up to 19 solar years. They were worn as ceremonial hats by Bronze Age oracles. They were thought to be king priests. And you can imagine at the time, they were thought to have supernatural powers because they were beginning to understand the seasons and things like that. They had some limited predictive powers in terms of when was the right time to sow crops and plant and so on. They were the kind of lords of time. So they were very important people. And of course, because they're very important, they had to look just that bit taller with the help of these sorts of hats. What about the sorting hat? That's really easy now with modern technology. I mean, I'm using an old scanner here, but I did talk to some MEG scientists. Does anyone do MEG anymore, actually? I didn't read much about magnetoencephalography, but you could easily see a scheme where the sorting hat has got some squids in it, superconducting quantum interference devices, the most sensitive measuring instruments known to man, and there's already various limited thought reading experiments underway with various forms of scanner. So let's just go perhaps to the last of the many things I examined in the science of Harry Potter. Levitation. Okay, you know, we've got Ron Weasley's enchanted Ford Anglia, we've got Hagrid's flying motorbike, you've got Harry and his chum zooming around in Quidditch. You know, how do they do it? Well, you can think of some primitive schemes, okay? We could have balloon suspension, the broomsticks, that's pretty slow, a bit primitive. You could imagine putting rockets on broomsticks. A bit of a sort of higher hazard if you've got a long kind of trailing robe. So what can science offer that's a bit sexier than that? Well, okay, what about dark energy, this sort of dilute anti-gravity force? I think that's pretty speculative, not least because we don't know what the hell dark energy is. Eugene Podkletnov came up with this sort of bizarre finding in '92 that over a fast rotating superconductor, there was an anti-gravitational effect. And it's one of those things, you know, you can imagine as a journalist at the Daily Telegraph, I had to write about anything up to about 6 stories a day. It's one of those stories you groan because you think this has to be total cobblers, but it came out in a reasonably reputable physics journal, and in fact NASA started doing, it was one of those findings where you couldn't afford not to look into it, a bit like cold fusion, you know, if it's right, crikey, it'll change everything. Anyway, no one's ever backed up that finding as far as I know. This is a Levitron. I used to try and do this demo live. And you can see this is the sort of thing that would happen, except it would go on for about 20 minutes and you'd all start screaming with boredom. But they're actually deeply satisfying things. You can see the little hand in the background is my now grumpy teenage daughter who would be completely mortified if she knew that I was using this video. But it's kind of interesting because it is quite magical, actually. And it is just good old-fashioned magnets that do it. And actually, Earnshaw in 1842 said quite firmly that you couldn't, use magnetic repulsion to make a stable arrangement. And it really had to wait for work by Sir Mike Berry at Bristol to actually explain how the levitron works. It's a kind of one of those nice examples where muggles just got on with that form of anti-gravity. Science had to catch up quite a long time later to explain it. And in a funny sort of way, you can think of atoms in the body, electrons in the atoms, as a bit like the levitron. You can imagine a magnetic field, the electrons in an atom rearrange their orbits slightly, so they're getting small persistent currents, and that opposes the external magnetic field. So we're all a bit diamagnetic. And so could you exploit this and this sort of levitron effect for a bit of so here we go. You can do this. So here's a levitated strawberry. Who did this work? Well, it was none other than the great André Geim, now Nobel Prize winner. Had the pleasure of chatting with André last year at Hay. He has got this fascinating approach to science where he believes in playfulness, doing things that seem a bit daft, but lead him in fascinating new directions. So he got quite into all of this. He's actually, you must, if you ever get a chance, listen to him because he's so straight. It's kind of terrifying, really. If you are, so I ask him a question. Roger, that's an incredibly stupid question, but I'll answer it anyway. That's the kind of typical André response you might get. I'm particularly fond of this bit of work. He did levitate his family hamster, and this, as far as I know, is the only paper co-authored by a hamster Tisha. So you see, come on, guys, this is the kind of future of your research, okay? Then finally, of course, I think frogs are a little bit more kind of Potteresque. And here we go. Here's a levitated frog. One small step for a frog, one giant leap for mankind. So there we are, just a little bit of a glimpse of the science of Harry Potter. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for this amazing talk. Do we
Never heard it called that before, but
do we have questions?
They've all been stunned into silence.
Yeah, how does that work? I could use that for the lectures sometimes.
No, I was amazed. I mean, I had people like, I think I mentioned, Bob May, who's then the president of the Royal Society and had been the government chief scientist. He heard that I was working on the book, and he'd written a daft paper for Nature. I think it was about the evolution of dragons or something like that. And he said, you've got to get that paper, you must get it into your book. So I actually got lots of help from lots of quite eminent scientists. Sorry, anyway, I just thought I'd tell you that.
Yeah.
Two questions is good, excellent.
One is, can you explain the Imperious curse?
Oh.
From mind control. The other is, do you have any potions? That would be good.
Well, I mean, you can, it's just, I used it as quite a thin excuse to dive into also. So, Imperious curse, I didn't do the Imperious curse, but if you just making it up as they go along, I mean, I do remember going to an MIT lab and seeing some of those, slightly spooky experiments where they've implanted electrodes in insects, and the guy twiddles a knob and the cockroach goes this way and twiddles it the other way and the cockroach, so you get a bit of a glimpse of how an Imperious curse might work. So I probably would have started there and then got wild. It's a bit like writing an April Fool's story. You start off with a plausible beginning point, and then after about 10 paragraphs, it's completely, utterly bonkers. There we are. What was the other one as well?
Lucky potion.
Lucky potion. Well, I know Richard Wiseman wrote a book about luck, so I would just ring up Richard and beg him to think of something clever. Actually, I really... Although I do think we are, in a strange way, you could delve into neuroscience again, because, clearly we're more startled by coincidences than we should be. We're not good at figuring out the probability of things. We probably think we're a bit luckier, oh gosh, we both got the same birthday, isn't that amazing? And it's quite fascinating. You can then, there's some interesting literature on why our ability to think about, you're walking through the woods, you hear a rustle in the undergrowth, it's 100,000 years ago. Do you think, oh, it's just the wind in the trees, or do you think it's a foreign forest demon or spirit that's going to kill you? Well, if you think the former, you could be killed by Ugg from the neighboring tribe or by some sort of animal. If you think the latter, and you see agency and dark forces in the shadows, you've got a higher chance of survival. So there's some interesting ideas that, and of course it's the usual evolutionary speculative nonsense really ultimately, but it's kind of quite tantalizing to think about this, that we have a predisposition, to see patterns when there are none, which is a kind of, we're leading a little bit towards luck, a bit. You're not entirely satisfied, but anyway, there we are. I tried my best, come on. Can I have some easy questions now, please? I think that's it. There we are.
Okay, so,
I think you're desperate for a drink, and I don't blame you, actually. So
thanks.
Thank you very much.
Roger,
Great pleasure.
for coming over. Thank you.